The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whatever time you might be listening. Welcome to another edition of Ask Claire along the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. My name is Claire Hall. I'm your host of this program, and if you've been listening these past few months as we've gotten up and going, you have come to realize that this is a pretty wide-ranging, freewheeling program, but we focus on a few areas that are special interests, special passions of mine, and certainly one of those is the history of the great game of baseball, and especially books about that wonderful history. And so I'm very happy to welcome to the program today author Noel Hynd. Good afternoon, since it is afternoon when we're recording. I'm great, and I want to thank you for being here. And first off, we're going to focus on a baseball book of yours, but writing about baseball, it's kind of a departure for you. You're a very prolific author, and most of your books are not in this genre. So just maybe mention that briefly and what your kind of stock and trade is.
Well, normally, if there is such a thing as normal, I write spy stories, espionage fiction. The best-known one was one called Flowers from Berlin, which has sold more than 1 million copies, including hardcover a couple of decades ago, and then very steadily in paperback, and then eventually in digital, meaning ebooks on Amazon. I've done, I guess, about 7 or 8 spy thrillers, about 7 supernatural thrillers, and then a couple of nonfiction, both of them falling into the baseball territory, including the one that we're going to be talking about shortly, I would guess, The Giants of the Polo Grounds.
Exactly, The Giants of the Polo Grounds, and I think it is important for people to understand if they're passionate baseball readers, they may have heard of this title. They may have purchased it when it was a new book 30 years ago when the original edition came out. And I always like to brag on behalf of my guests, and I believe this was the New York Times that called it a compelling and comprehensive history of an extraordinary ball club. So the vote of the paper of record, that must have been pretty satisfying. But now it is out again, but, I even hesitate to call it a new edition because it is, for all intents and purposes, a brand new, greatly expanded book. I think Amazon said the original was something like 375 pages. The new one is something like 600 pages. Is that correct?
About 625, proving, I suppose, for once and for all that I cannot shut up when I get a subject that I like. What happened was earlier this year, I had a little bit of a break while a editor was editing a spy thriller called Firebird, which is also out. So I was waiting for him to get back to me on his edits, and I had gradually, since the advent of digital publishing, I've been gradually republishing and doing some touch-up and re-editing of my older books. And The Giants of the Polo Grounds was one that I had never gotten to. And quite frankly, I didn't even think there was that much interest in it anymore. And then I started to go on some sites on Facebook, and as soon as I put my name in some of these baseball sites, people were saying, gee, I wish I could get a digital edition of that book. I had it years ago. So I started to look at it and re-edit it, and then I realized that while I had all of the baseball stuff properly in the first edition, there was so much that was going on with the New York Giants and at the great stadium in New York where they played, which was called the Polo Grounds, that I decided to get into some of that. So I got into some of the colorful characters, to say the least, who surrounded the team, both men and women, and the other people who performed at the Polo Grounds and who hung out with the players and who, from a political sense in New York, were at least partially responsible for the success of the team. To be specific on the latter part, Mayor Jimmy Walker, who was mayor during the Jazz Age in New York, and when he was a state legislator, he was what came to be known as the father of Sunday baseball. You couldn't have a professional baseball game on the Sabbath in New York City, and a lot of people worked on every day except Sunday. So the ball clubs, there were 3 of them at the time, really wanted to be able to open their gates for paid admissions on Sunday, and Walker got it done. So again, the 375 pages to 625 is exploring a lot of the boxing, a lot of the soccer, some of the football, and some of the performers who performed at the Polo Grounds and who were involved at least tangentially with the baseball club, the New York Giants.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story. As I read the original and eagerly when I realized there was so much new material, really 625 pages. This is more like a 2-volume edition, and all that rich history and context that you've added. I'm working my way through it now and rediscovering it all over again. So let's go back to the 1980s and maybe, what stimulated you? What was the spark that made you want to write the story of the New York Giants in the first place?
Well, first of all, I'm old enough, I hate to admit it in a public forum, but I'm old enough to admit going to see the New York Giants play at the Polo Grounds. When I was a kid, I was growing up in the New York area. I was born in New York City, but I grew up in Connecticut. And my favorite player when I used to watch baseball with my father was Stan Musial of the Cardinals. And Musial, of course, would come to New York and hit what seemed to be like 565 against the New York teams because they both had short right field walls. But I wanted to see Musial, so my dad took me in 1956 to see the Cardinals play, and then we went again in 1957. So unlike a lot of people who are alive today, whose first experience with the Polo Grounds was via the Mets, I actually remembered the New York Giants and remembered them very fondly, even though they were pretty much a 6th-place team in an 8-team league for most of the time that I was following them and watching their games. Anyway, many years later, I'm living in New York City in the mid-'80s, and I was aware of all of the new books coming out on the Brooklyn Dodgers. So I thought, why doesn't someone write a book on the Giants? So I nominated myself for that duty and was turned down by every publisher I went to because, A, they claimed I was a novelist and a writer of espionage suspense, not sports, much less baseball. And similarly, they claimed there was no interest in such a team because it didn't even exist anymore. Well, over the course of the next 2 years, I became an outside contributor for Sports Illustrated, and then the same agent went back with the same proposal to the same publishers and basically said, this is a writer for Sports Illustrated.
The host has joined the conference.
And so that changed the terrain quite a bit, and I got a contract from Doubleday and Company to write the book for the first time.
Well, that's great. That's something as a longtime baseball fan, even though I've grown up out here on the West Coast, it always struck me as strange. I mean, there's such an abundance of literature about the New York Yankees and the Brooklyn Dodgers, but really, just as always seemed to me, and your book definitely fills a void, just a paucity of literature about the Giants, especially considering, their very rich history.
Yeah, it amazed me, and it created a void for me to step into. It became a much, much bigger subject, of course, than I thought. I thought I could begin in 1900 and end in 1957 and basically limit it to what went on in the field. And it was really a much bigger story of that, because much the way that baseball is the story of America or the city that it's being played in, the story of the New York Giants is the story of New York, of an Irish infrastructure to the early teams, and then a necessity on the part of all three New York teams to get Jewish players and Italian players to bring people through the turnstiles. And then, of course, there was the competition, incredible competition and rivalry between the Giants and the Dodgers in the National League. And then who the hell do they end up playing in most of the time in the World Series? It's the team from the Bronx.
Yeah, it's an atmosphere. I was just born a couple of years after the great move, but somehow just being steeped in baseball history, I think the younger fans who talk Yankees or Red Sox, they just, they cannot appreciate the intensity of that three-way rivalry, especially in the era when all the teams, sometimes one was ascendant or two were ascendant and one was down, but I don't see how you can write the history of baseball and really from the beginning of the 20th century to at least the 1960s without talking about the New York Giants, Brooklyn Dodgers, and New York Yankees.
Yeah, a lot of people from other areas of the country, I think, sometimes get a little tired of hearing about it. But those were the best teams. They had the money. They could get the best players. They had great scouts and scouting systems. And, other teams like, say, the Cardinals in the National League would take a run at the top for a while, but then they would have fallow periods. But really from the 40s through the time that the two teams deserted New York in 1957, there was one or both up there winning the pennant in just about every year.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, when you finally got to see the New York Giants in person those last two seasons, they were a sixth-place club. And yet, they were just a couple of years removed from a truly amazing world championship, one of the most memorable World Series, certainly maybe the single most memorable play, Willie Mays' catch. So I would imagine even then a lot of that aura was still there, even though the team unfortunately was on the decline at that point.
It's amazing looking back on it that you had this incredible world championship in 1954 in which they defeated the Cleveland Indians, who won, I believe, 111 games out of 154 in 4 games in the World Series. And 3 years later, they're leaving. It boggles the mind. And in fact, if there were a Dodger fan sitting across from me, he or she would say, yeah, but the Brooklyn team won in 1955, and 2 years later they were leaving. So it went down the tubes pretty damn quickly in the middle of the 1950s. There were a lot of factors. Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, yeah, which is a real shame, but as you were about to say, a lot of factors, and again, people don't appreciate, just how different economically, culturally, politically things were then. I don't think you would see Major League Baseball, certainly the National League, ever abandoning one of its largest markets like that again.
I would doubt it very much. A couple of years ago when the Dodgers were changing hands, maybe it was when Frank McCourt was selling, there were actually people in New York asking whether, do you think the Dodgers will move back to Brooklyn? I've never heard such a silly question in my life. Of course they will not move back to Brooklyn. First of all, there's the Mets and the Yankees both have the geographic rights to Brooklyn now. But why would you abandon one of the most lucrative areas in the country, which has one of the most popular ballparks? But we're going off on a tangent, and I think your point is it's hard to imagine how this happened, but it was a different country. The politics were different, and the way cities were managed were different back then.
Very true. Okay, we are talking with Noel Hynd. He is the author of The Giants of the Polo Grounds, published this year, 2018. And again, tell folks how they can track down this wonderful, rich, entertaining history of one of the memorable ball clubs of all time.
To get a copy, all you have to do is own a computer or borrow somebody else's, go to Amazon. It's right there. My last name is spelled Hynd, and if you enter Polo Grounds, it will take you to the Amazon site, which will sell you or attempt to sell you either a trade paperback or a Kindle download. And if you are a member of Kindle Unlimited, you can actually read the book for free and look at the more than 100 pretty pictures, really some fabulous illustrations, some of them in color, which I added to this edition. One of the big differences between the edition in the 1980s and this one is the collection of illustrations is completely different. There are more than 100 now, and basically I was limited to newspaper pictures in black and white, maybe about 40 of them in the first edition.
Well, let's take another slight detour, but not really a detour. I mean, when you talk about the New York Giants, we could probably spend the rest of the program just naming off Hall of Famers and colorful characters, but one of them is the subject of another baseball book. So because this is a book that is still available as well, thanks to, in part to Amazon and Kindle, Marquard and Seeley. For the uninitiated, tell us that story, if you could, in a nutshell, Noel, and why you want to write about them.
This was a story that took place in the years right before World War I, involving a New York Giants pitcher named Richard, nicknamed Rube Marquard, who won 19 straight games over the course of, I think it might have been the 1911 or 12 season. And he was kind of a character. He was a Midwesterner, but one of those guys who adapted to the fast life in New York very, very quickly. And he, like a lot of players back then, would be looking for sources of income, legal, hopefully, after the baseball season had ended. And one thing that a lot of ball players did was they made personal appearances on the stage in vaudeville, mostly in New York, but some went on tour. Marquard developed a brief act. It was mostly so that, fans could come up and actually sit in the 10th row and see these guys who were their heroes in person in the off season. And often they would tell jokes or tell baseball stories. But Marquard went a little further. First of all, he, during his second season, fell in love with a performer named Blossom Seeley. Now, fine so far, except she was married to another performer at the time, but that didn't stop Rube, and he and Blossom basically became the Joe DiMaggio and Marilyn Monroe of the day. And they also developed their own act on Broadway, which was called Marquard and Seeley, which is also what the book was called. And it was scandalous. It was fodder for the tabloids. And it was really a fascinating story. And I discovered when I was writing the Giants book that I didn't have room to do justice to the story. So after the Giants book was published, I got a contract with a small pub press in Massachusetts and did about a 200 and some page book on Marquard and Seeley. It was kind of a unique chapter in both of their lives. They eventually got married. They had a son. I don't believe he's alive anymore. Very nice man. I talked to him on the phone 25 years ago. And they eventually divorced because there were too many pressures professionally on a two-career marriage. Celie wanted to stay in show business. Mark Ward wanted her to stay home and be his wife. And they just couldn't get it together over what has really become very common now in our day and age, which is, both partners in the marriage having a career. Anyway, so I told that story, which took place over the course of maybe 1912 to 1916, 17, when they were in love and in show business together, and a team both in public and in private.
And it's richly entertaining, and again, it is still available through the magic of Amazon and Kindle. And if anybody enjoys, especially reading about the New York Giants and that era, I'll highly recommend that as well. Could we play a little name association, and you offer a few thoughts on just, the first thing that comes to mind, or the most salient feature of some of the great names in New York Giant history? Are you
Sure,
game?
go ahead.
Okay. John McGraw.
Well, I could do entire books on that, but McGraw put the franchise on the map. It was a failing franchise around 1903 with horrible management, finishing in 8th place. And McGraw came up to New York from Baltimore and brought some players with him, and basically founded what then became, for the next 30 years at least, maybe even 40 years, one of the preeminent franchises in the National League. And certainly from 1905 to 24, 25, they were the franchise in baseball. Only the Yankees finally eclipsed them in New York under the new management of Jacob Ruppert in the early 1920s. In fact, they played each other in 3 World Series in a row, 1921, 22, 23. The Giants won the first 2, and then Babe Ruth got hot, and the Yankees won in 1923. It partially resulted in Yankee Stadium being built and being so successful, and it was really in that year that the two teams, that the Yankees eclipsed the Giants and became the preeminent team in baseball.
But what a run they had up till then. How about Big Six, the man who is co-holder of the National League career pitching record for most wins, none other than Christy Mathewson?
Well, Christy Mathewson, yes, he, I think to this day, owns the record for most wins in the National League, something like 373. Mathewson, you could argue that Mathewson made baseball respectable, because baseball, up until Mathewson arrived, was basically a street fight. It was tough immigrant guys, mostly Irish, with very, very little education, and they were tough. They were hard drinking. They were hard fighting. They played hard, but they had no options in life other than playing baseball. Mathewson was a college-educated man. He went to Bucknell University. I believe he graduated, and he was a symbol of middle-class respectability. And kids who loved the game could point to Christy Mathewson as a role model, as a figure that you could look up to, and they were absolutely right. So in addition, the great players are usually more than what they've done on the playing field, and Mathewson certainly was that also in the way he gave respectability to baseball. I'll add an odd final footnote to that. The day I finished the first edition of the book, I went to a Bucknell Penn football game, and by the eeriest of coincidences, the path from where I parked my car led through a cemetery which was near the Bucknell University football field, and I walked right past Mathewson's grave on that day completely by chance. Make of it what you will.
Wow. I mean, just amazing. Okay, so let's go from someone who is not a Hall of Famer, not a role model, but certainly a very colorful member of those early 20th century Giants. How about Turkey Mike Donlin?
Well, Mike Donlin played in the first decade of the 20th century, before Rube Marquardt. And Donlin was a character. He was one of the original lounge lizards of the 20th century. He was a guy who loved the nightlife in New York. He loved it more than playing baseball, but he was a remarkably skilled baseball guy, too. He had a penchant for publicity, a great taste for exciting women, motor cars, and eventually he ended up in Hollywood and was in several movies. He struck up an acquaintance and friendship with Buster Keaton, who was a huge baseball fan, and was in Keaton's famous film, The General. McGraw and Donlin. McGraw loved having Donlin in the lineup and hated having him in the locker room. Donlin was born, I believe, on May 30th of 18-something or other, and McGraw's frequent saying about Donlin was he was born on Memorial Day, and he's been parading around ever since. That's Mike Donlin.
That's great, and we're talking about a book just filled with great characters and great anecdotes like this. And I hate to say we're running down on time, but I know there are people listening who are passionate fans, readers, and historians like me. Also, ones who maybe this may be a wonderful new discovery to them, and certainly. We've talked a lot about the New York baseball Giants, and that especially with this brand new edition, that you bring in more about the football Giants, about college football, boxing, soccer, all kinds of things that happened at the Polo Grounds, which really was the premier Manhattan sporting venue, but yet you didn't mention polo being played there. So somebody might be saying, no polo at the Polo Grounds? So please comment on that.
No polo at these Polo Grounds. The original area where the Giants played in the 1880s in New York was a section of Central Park up around 110th Street, and it was an area that was generically known as the Polo Grounds because people played polo there before there was any professional baseball in New York. Hence, the place where the Giants played was, at first, they played up at the Polo Grounds, but the name kind of traveled with them. So it's sort of almost as if with Citi Field now, there are still some people say, I'm going to go see the Mets. We're going out to Shea. It was just a generic term that stayed with the team. And there are actually 2 or 3 different Polo Grounds. The location, of course, changed. The team could no longer play in Central Park after in the 1890s, and they found an area up at 155th Street and 8th Avenue, and that is where they first constructed a stadium with wooden stands. In the early part of the century, of course, there was no Yankee Stadium, and the Yankees had a place called Hilltop Park, which stood where Columbia Presbyterian Hospital now stands in Upper Manhattan.
And then at one point the 2 teams shared the Polo Grounds, and then John McGraw didn't like the fact that the Yankees were on the rise, so they thought they would show them something by kicking them out, never thinking that they would end up being able to build Yankee Stadium right across the river.
Yeah, McGraw felt that if they moved to the Bronx, that would be the end of them. He quite mistaken.
Indeed. But it is a rich history. It's a fascinating history. We have only been able to scratch the surface in this conversation. So Noel Hynd, Hynd, that's what you need to look for if you're tracking down this marvelous, marvelous book, The Giants of the Polo Grounds. I want to thank you for being my guest on Ask Claire, and just if you have a final word or thought before we have to sign on.
Not really. The funny thing about the subject matter, the New York Giants, that comes to mind is after the team moved to San Francisco, they were almost a little embarrassed by their roots in New York, and now they've sort of embraced it. So it's not unusual for San Francisco Giants fans to buy the book or, read part of it just to see where their team came from.
Okay, well, go ahead, I'm sorry.
That was it. I was just...
Yeah, whether it be a San Francisco Giant fan, a New York Giant fan, or just a lover of a good story, highly recommend it. Noel, thanks for being with us. And
thanks for your time. I appreciate it. Take care. Same to you. Bye.
Bye-bye. And until next time, happy trails to you all till we meet again.